So now Vaddhaka is going to come up and give his second talk in the series. Who is Reborn, I think.
Yep.
Yesterday was statistically the most depressing day of the year. So good topic. But I must say, I find it very invigorating actually from the term hearing from Vaddhaka. Yeah, so over to Vaddhaka.
Thank you. So this is the second talk in the series of 6 talks on the theme of what happens when we die. And as Arta Siddhi was saying, the title of the talk this evening is Who is Reborn? And to start with, I'd like just to recapitulate briefly what I was going through last week, because it's important background for today's talk. So last week, I explained the Buddha's teaching that if we search in our experience, we cannot find anything that is permanent, that is under our complete control, and that is not conducive to suffering. There is no Atman. The Buddha teaches an Atman, not Atman. There is no unchanging, separate essence of self that is immortal. We are empty of a fixed and separate self-nature. And I went on, does this then mean that we do not exist? That we are an illusion? No, I explained, each person exists as a unique, dynamic psycho-bundle of experience that flows through times. And this dynamic bundle flows through life in dependence upon conditions, including, crucially, our volitions, our karmic choices, and their consequences. We are continually making and remaking ourselves in this life. There is continual change, but there is also a recognizable continuity. But an unchanging element, the real me, an essence of self, is not there. So when we ask the question, who lives? The answer is a person or a unique psychophysical bundle of experience with the potential for continual evolution and change. And when we then ask the question, who dies? Then the answer is that with the death of the physical body, that particular unique psychophysical bundle of experience ceases to exist. That person ceases to exist. But if rebirth exists, and we are convinced that there is no fixed and separate essence of self that survives from life to life, and we accept that when the physical body dies, that person ceases to exist, we must then ask, who or what is reborn? How much of me will there be in another lifetime? How much of what we usually think of as myself will there be in a future life? Indeed, will anything continue after death of the physical body? So according to the Buddha's teaching, something does continue. And what continues into future lives is what's called our samskaras, our karmic tendencies, the pattern of our habitual actions and tendencies. Our karmic tendencies carry forward into another life. And there they combine with a new set of genes, a new body, maybe a new nationality, language, culture, education, all of which come together to help create a new being, a new, different person. As Buddhist scholar and practitioner Andrew Olendzki puts it, This means that we have to accept the fact that I or we will not survive this life. There will be a continuity, a causal thread, but the next lifetime will be another being. Buddhism says, he goes on, that the next being will be neither the same as nor different from the current being. But we tend to hear the bit about it not being different because we grasp after survival, and we miss the significance of the bit about it not being the same. And he finishes, having a sense of self has been an important factor in our survival as a species. But a traceable thread of causal continuity from one being to another is very different from the sort of personal survival after death we crave. So something of us carries forward from one life to another life, but not the person, not this unique psychophysical bundle of experience. How then might we react to this teaching, this very important teaching? This is a vital question. Last week, when I explained that there is no permanent and separately existing essence of self, but instead there is a person, a unique psychophysical bundle of experience, someone perceptively commented to me that there might then be a danger that we reify the person, that we make concrete the idea of a person, and instead of grasping or clinging to the sense of a self, to Atman, we instead cling to the person. And this is a real danger. So how might we react to the Buddha's teaching? And to help you to consider your own response, I'd like to share with you the very contrasting personal responses of two particular individuals, both of whom I have already referred to in this series of talks. And the first is the person I've just quoted, Andrew Olendzki, Buddhist scholar and Buddhist practitioner and expert on early Buddhism. And the second person is Professor Paul Williams, until his retirement in 2011, the director of Bristol University's Centre for Buddhist Studies, one of the world's leading authorities on Mahayana Buddhism, and for much of his adult life, a practicing Buddhist in a Tibetan tradition. So Andrew Olendzki is a specialist in early Buddhism, and Paul Williams is a specialist in later or Mahayana Buddhism. But they both agree with the description I have given of the Buddhist teaching of An-Atman, of not self, what happens when we die, and what carries forward to re-become in a new life. They both agree on that Buddhist teaching, very clearly agree. So first of all, Andrew Olendzki's response. I'm going to quote him at length. This is what he says. What we have been given is incredibly precious. Look inside and around us. We have consciousness or awareness, nature, other beings, a mind and a heart. Why do we have to grasp for survival after the death of this body? What we have now is precious enough, each moment and succeeding moment of awareness. He continues, this perspective on rebirth or rebecoming derives from a universe based on generosity or dharma. We are the recipients of immeasurable generosity when we are given life, consciousness, and the company of other beings. We fully participate in this cycle of giving when we give up and give back all we have received. The quality of each moment of awareness and the quality of our actions of body, speech, and mind is where we construct our character and where we give back to the universe what we have been so generously given. He continues, so in the next lifetime, I will no longer be me, but I will have given myself over to another. The same can be said for this very life. Every moment, I am the recipient of inherited karma from previously existing configurations of an ever-changing bundle of processes. And every moment, I give myself over to future configurations of an ever-changing bundle of processes. And he concludes, how can we help but be bodhisattvas? We are living for the benefit of all beings. The question is, with what quality will we live the present moment? So Olendzki delights in the possibility of living this life in such a way that we give something back, we give something beneficial to another being who will come after us. Although they will not be us, something of us will carry forward. And it's up to us in this life to decide what we give to this new being. So Andrew Olendzki's take on death and rebecoming then is a very positive one. So what about Professor Paul Williams? I said that Paul Williams was, for much of his life, a practicing Buddhist in a Tibetan tradition. But he is no longer a Buddhist. In 2002, and I can remember this very well, he astonished fellow practicing Buddhists and fellow Buddhist scholars by converting from Buddhism to Roman Catholicism. It stunned everybody when this happened. Now, there were several reasons behind his decision to cease being a practicing Buddhist and to become a Roman Catholic. But one of the key reasons relates precisely to his personal and deep consideration of the Buddhist teaching on anatman, on not self, and therefore what happens when we die. Williams fully understood that if we accept the Buddhist teaching, then it is clear that any rebirth or rebecoming is not the same person as the one who died. And correctly, I think, he points out that many of us, many Buddhists, obscure this fact in our choice of language by referring to my rebirth and expressing concern for my future lives, even sometimes wondering what I was in a previous life. So Paul Williams began a deep reflection on what death means to him. And this is how he describes the impact of this reflection. I began to think that if Buddhism were correct, then unless I gained enlightenment or something like it in this life, I, Paul Williams, the person I am, would have no hope. For the rebirth of Paul Williams that flows from not attaining enlightenment would not be the same person as Paul Williams. Clearly, I was not going to attain enlightenment in this life. So and I suspect all my friends and families, must have in themselves finally no hope. Thus, Buddhism, for me, appeared to be hopeless. And then he continues his reflection. But was I absolutely sure Buddhism was true? Christianity, he thought, at least offers hope. He goes on. If Christianity is right, our lives, as the lives of the individual persons we are infinitely valuable. And we all have the possibility, as the persons we are, of unimaginable perfection. So that was the reflection, part of the reflections that led him to convert from Buddhism to Roman Catholicism. There were many others, but that is interesting. He pinpointed the Buddha's teaching on anatman, on not self, and the Buddha's teaching on the dissolution of the person at death. So when I consider the two responses of Andrew Lenski and Paul Williams to what happens after death, I am very much inspired by Andrew Lenski's words. I find them incredibly inspiring. But if I'm honest, there is a part of me that clings to the wish that I, Dharmachari Vaddhaka, continue as a person after the death of the physical body. If I'm honest, that wish is there somewhere, and I cling to some of that wish. So I think what I'm saying is we have to try to understand what happened for Paul Williams. He not only engaged with his intellect, he deeply engaged with all of his beings, with his emotions. He didn't consider death in the abstract. He examined honestly how he felt about the death of himself, the person Paul Williams. I remember when this happened, Paul Williams received a lot of criticism, astonished criticism from within the Buddhist world, with one exception. And it was Vishwapani, writing in the then magazine Dharma Life, tried to explain why this had happened and said, basically, Paul Williams looked into the abyss and then he made his mind up. And we should feel some compassion for his decision. I thought it was very interesting and very perceptive. So I'm not inclined to jump on the bandwagon of being very critical of Paul Williams. Nevertheless, we might think that for all of his academic knowledge of Buddhism and all of his practice of Buddhism, something must have been lacking for him to respond in the way he did. Something must have been lacking in his understanding or his practice. And we might think that real practitioners, like Tibetan monastics, would have a very different response to the prospect of death. And it so happens that an academic study published in 2018 allows us to examine just that, the responses of Tibetan monastics to the prospect of death. And the study involved quite a few academics, including a man called Jay Garfield, a very good specialist on Buddhist studies in the United States. I referred to him in the talk in the first week. So Jay Garfield was a part of this group of academics studying responses to the idea of death or the prospect of death. So the study examined in detail the relationship between attitudes about death and the self among Hindus, among Westerners, including religious Christians and non-religious Westerners, and 3 Buddhist groups: lay Tibetan, lay Bhutanese, and monastic Tibetans. And before carrying out the investigation, the researchers speculated that Tibetan monastics would be less inclined to fear death. They speculated that fully understanding the concept of not self, of an-atman, would lead them to have less fear of death. So what did the study find? Well, first, as might be expected, the Tibetan monastics showed a much stronger and more consistent rejection of the idea of a persisting self than did the lay Tibetan and Bhutanese Buddhists and the Westerners and the Hindus. The Tibetan monastics understood clearly the implications of the Buddha's teachings on an-atman. And the monastics said that they understood that this meant there was no reason to fear death. But they went deeper, using various psychological questionnaires and so on that I'm not an expert on. They questioned more deeply, the investigators, and they questioned in particular the Tibetan monastics. And to their surprise, their complete surprise, monastic Tibetan Buddhists showed significantly greater fear of death than any other group involved in the study. The Tibetan monastics showed greater fear of death than any other group involved in the study. And in particular, the study found that the Tibetan Buddhist monastics feared self-annihilation more than any other group. So the authors were absolutely astonished. They had to report, it is particularly striking that even non-religious Westerners reported much less fear of self-annihilation than the monastic Buddhists we studied. The teaching of not self was seemingly ineffective at a deep level of overcoming a fear of death. So how to explain? So the authors, they've done all this work. How can they explain this finding? And this is what they said, or this is what the conclusion they came to. Whilst the Tibetan monastics ideologically accepted the doctrine of not self, the author's conjecture is that the monastics retained a powerful sense of personal continuity within a biological life. They were connected very strongly to the sense of a person in a biological life. And they said that the sense of personal continuity within a lifespan was encouraged by many of the stories told in Tibetan Buddhism, which are presented from a continuous personal perspective. The story of Marpa, the story, I think that most people will be most familiar, the story of Milarepa, and so on. There's many such stories that give you a story of a personal continuity. And when faced with the prospect of death, the authors conjectured, this loss of personal continuity or personality is to be feared. For all their rational acceptance of not self, of an-atman, they still clung to a sense of personal identity. And the authors put it like this. So, paradoxically, Buddhist monastics who report much less belief in the reality or permanence of the self than do members of other religious groups are more terrified of the annihilation of that thing in which they do not believe, and of that which they take to be impermanent, and of that which they do not believe constitutes their personal essence, than are groups who believe that the thing is real, permanent, and constitutes their essence. It's a complete conundrum. But, almost as an afterthought, they add in something, I think, what is really significant. This is another potential factor into the explanation, which is very important. The authors comment that none of the Tibetan monastics were long-term meditators. None of them were long-term meditators. And they wonder if the results would be different from monastic meditators. Now, we in the West often assume that all Buddhist monastics in the East meditate, but many don't have a regular meditation practice. It's an assumption we make, which is not true. So this, I think, may help to explain why the Tibetan monastics can intellectually accept the teaching of accept the teaching against the persistence of a persisting self, but when pressed more deeply, may balk at the loss of that self. And the importance of this, I think, is illustrated with a story from the early Buddhism of the Pali Canon. There's a really interesting story which relates directly to this. It's the story of a monk called Khemaka. And Khemaka is desperately ill. And he's visited by other monks concerned to hear how he's doing, to see what help he needs. But despite his illness, Khemaka gives the visiting monks a teaching. And the background to this teaching is that one of the Buddha's lists is this, it goes like this, that there are 10 fetters or chains that need to be broken to reach enlightenment, to reach full enlightenment. There are 10 fetters or chains that need to be broken to reach enlightenment. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a practitioner who progresses such that they fully break the first 3 fetters becomes what's called a stream entrant. And they only have to live up to 7 more lives before they will gain full enlightenment. A practitioner who progresses such that they fully break the first 5 of the 10 fetters will be reborn into a heavenly realm from where they will gain enlightenment. They will not be reborn again into the human realm. But there are still 5 more fetters to be broken. And only a fully enlightened being, someone who attains enlightenment in this life, breaks those final 5 fetters and all 10 fetters and gains enlightenment. And amongst the last 5 fetters, it's is a fetter that's called the conceit that I am. The conceit that I am. And the conceit that I am is a clinging to the sense of a persisting self. And the monk Khemaka likens this clinging to the faint smells or scents that cling to clothes even after they have been washed. So even after you've washed clothes, maybe there's a faint sense or smell that still clings there. Further washing is required to get rid of the remaining smell. So Khemaka uses that metaphor to teach the other monks that there is a fundamental difference between the intellectual realization that there is no permanent self to be found anywhere in experience and the total freedom from the conceit that I am and from the ego that comes with full awakening. And the total freedom from the conceit that I am and from the ego requires us to rigorously direct mindfulness to the impermanent nature of all aspects of experience through a comprehensive meditation program. So, you or I, we may think of ourselves as good practicing Buddhists. We may even still be inclined a little bit to look down on Paul Williams. But we need to be aware that when we face truly up to the possibility of death, we may experience a strong primitive fear of self-annihilation, a fear of the death of the person that we are. So I don't know, for example, whether the Tibetan tradition that Paul Williams practiced in, whether he was a regular meditator. There are Tibetan traditions where meditation is not the foremost practice. But that may have been playing a part in his experience. So to finish on a positive note, I want to remind you of what Andrew Walensky said. So, in the next lifetime, I will no longer be me, but I will have given myself over to another. The same can be said for this very life. Every moment, I am the recipient of inherited karma from previously existing configurations of an ever-changing bundle of processes. And every moment, I give myself over to future configurations of an ever-changing bundle of processes. How can we help but be bodhisattvas? We are living for the benefit of all beings. The question is, with what quality will we live the present moment? And I'll leave it there for this week. A few minutes for questions.
Yeah, right on time. Thanks very, very much. Yeah, so we've got time for questions.
What does it mean to need however many more lifetimes to break, if you don't break certain fetters, then you need more lifetimes to get enlightenment? How does that square with the idea that you're not a continuing self?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, the thing is, we put things in that way and it blurs things, doesn't it? It blurs things. So I suppose technically the answer would be that if those karmic tendencies that we have created, those habitual tendencies, those dispositions in this life, we give them on to somebody else, and if they continue to work on them, because there's no excuse for not continuing to work on them, 7 other lifetimes of different beings, but there still being a continuity, will lead to someone being enlightened. But we put it, don't we? You won't be enlightened for 7 more lifetimes. We tend to fudge it. We talk about my rebirth and so on, but the Buddha's teaching is actually, when you break it down, quite clear. Quite clear. So you're right to say that potentially we can get mixed up. But that's how we tend to talk about things. And it's a mistaken thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good anymore.
You were talking about the continuity of karmic propensities.
Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, we can see that actions from previous lives, and this is what I've been understood, that you do actions in previous lives and that has an effect on future lives. When we're talking about propensities, does that mean that my guess is it's too literal to say that you get angry in one life, you're bound to get angry in the next life as a karmic propensity? Were you going as far as that, or you think it's just there's a thread of karmic seeds, you might say?
Well, I think the thing is, it's like it's working on the dispositions that may be quite deeply there in our unconscious that are there. So, for example, I might think that I've worked, I've tried very hard to work on my tendency to anger, because in my earlier working life, I used to get angry very often. Eventually, it made me ill. And I would think that I'd sort of, I'd work on it ethically with metta and with meditation, with metta and so on in my daily life and so on, and think I'm making progress. And then I have a dream in which all hell breaks loose, and there's extreme anger bursts out. And what I realize is that that disposition is still there within me, that there's a lot more work to be done, so that we sometimes think that we are making progress, and then we get a nasty reminder that these deep-rooted dispositions don't disappear overnight. I suppose that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's what are the real habitual tendencies, conscious and unconscious, that we've developed? Can we really work with them? Because that's what carries forward. Does that make sense in terms of what I mean by disposition? They can be quite deep-rooted. And maybe some of them are inherited from a previous being. Maybe some of them come with our genes. I don't know. I mean, I know that my brother and I have a tendency to anxiety. Where does that come from? So I can work with that, but I also know from my dreams, I still have a tendency to anxiety, and friends will point that out. So there's deep-rooted tendencies. That's what I mean by dispositions. We don't easily shift them. And they will carry forward. Do you want to come back on that? Actually, don't.
No, not now.
No. All right.
Yeah. There was one more question. Just actually, could we just have Luke? And we'll come back to it if we don't mind.
Do you feel like the dispositions it is like desire, in a sense that like anger is the desire for something to be not the way it is?
Yes. Yeah.
So most dispositions are all rooted back to desire.
Yes, as long as we are powered by tanha, by desire, by thirst, that will manifest in various ways. Yeah.
So in a sense,
but that is one of the fetters that we need to work on the most. So you can weaken desire, but to get rid of it is to be fully enlightened. Yeah.
So, thanks, Luke. If we don't mind.
Interested to know which of the two authors that you named, which of them would you would you credit, would you put your support behind? Because
Which of the two
authors?
You mean Olendzki and Williams?
Yeah.
Or Andrew Olendzki? I understand Paul Williams, and I'm not arrogant enough to think that I don't have some of the same feelings that he had. I think I do. I can feel it. But I want to aspire to be like the words of Andrew Olendzki. And that's my aspiration, what I want to work. And I want to have that aspiration very strongly so that it carries through to the next being.
Can I follow a question? Is that you mentioned some Tibetans don't meditate. I presume they do something, an equivalence of a meditation practice.
I don't know. I think they spend a lot of time studying Dharma and engaging in debates, but they don't necessarily meditate.
And that's the game changer. That's.
But the argument is that meditation, Khemaka's argument is if you don't meditate deeply, if you don't practice mindfulness deeply, looking at and examining impermanence in every aspect of your experience, then you're not going to break through. That's what I take from Khemaka's teaching. It's a very important teaching, I think.
Sort of reflection really is thinking about how I think it's the first author you talked about kind of the importance of being the quality in this very moment.
Yes.
The risk is that we can kind of get almost obsessed with the next life or,
Yes.
or doing something now to affect the next.
Yes.
As opposed to the quality of doing it, just doing it
Yes,
doing it with your full whole heart.
Yes.
Not for any kind of future gain. And I
Exactly
think
right.
it's such a human thing, and I think about it all the time.
yeah,
But I think that was really beautifully said about the quality
yes.
of doing what we're doing right now.
Giving of yourself right now in
Right
every
now,
moment.
yeah,
Yeah,
rather than 'cause it's
yeah,
like,
without
it's
thinking,
all in the
sort of
next
like this will
life,
help
I
me.
be
in-
over there.
Yeah, whatever.
You know,
Yeah,
because I think that's somewhat, otherwise I think we become fearful of living
yes.
because it's like a fear base for the next, which is, I don't know.
No, you're
what I
absolutely
think
right. I
about.
think that's very well put.
Yeah.
Very well put.
Thanks, Julia. Luke and then Neil, yeah.
Oh, it was actually it was kind of in conjunction.
Oh, there we are.
It's a lot, but just it was about maybe aspiring for enlightenment is another desire.
Yeah.
To let go.
Yeah. Dharma Chanda.
A desire we have to let go of, Luke was saying.
So the desire to,
The aspiration to be enlightened,
yeah, is the desire.
is it another desire that will have to?
Well, you see, Dharma Chanda, I think, is like the aspiration to understand and act through the Dharma better than I do now. And it's a positive form of desire. Dharma Chanda is very different from a sensuous kind of desire, from Kama Chanda. So the Dharma Chanda is fine. I call it about, the aspiration to be a better person, to give something better to the next being, to integrate myself deeply into the Dharma. It is a desire. It's an aspiration. If I grasp after it and try to hold on to it, then it's a problem. But if I have that desire in terms of this is what I wish to give my life to, that's different.
Is that
Great talk,
answered?
Vaddhaka.
Yeah.
I'm just going to, just your reflection on, if you hadn't have told us which tradition each quote was from, just your reflection on Alensky's seems more like a Mahayana Buddhist. He's obviously more of a, he's a scholar of early Buddhism. I don't know what his practice is.
Sorry, my hearing's not brilliant. So.
So the Alensky sounds more Mahayana than the Paul Williams.
I think that's true. I mean, he understands the Mahayana, and it is interesting because the Bodhisattva spirit is there in early Buddhism. We think it's not, but it is. It is. It's often said it's not, but it is, and he reflects it very well. Yeah. Okay.